Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're going back in time to 1965 for a deep dive into a real classic. You want to know more about Gamera the Giant Monster, and we've done our homework here. We've got notes and articles, even a whole study guide, all to help us unearth some fun facts about this kaiju classic.
Yeah, it's amazing how much there is to unpack in a film that on the surface might seem like just another monster movie, but Gamera the Giant Monster really reflects some of those deep anxieties of the Cold War.
Okay, so let's set the stage. The movie starts with this super intense scene. American and unidentified aircraft are clashing over the Arctic. It's giving some major Cold War vibes right from the beginning.
Absolutely. And of course, that clash leads to a nuclear explosion, which awakens our giant turtle friend, Gamera. So he's not just some random monster popping up. His origin is directly tied to the very real fear of nuclear war that was hanging over everyone's heads in the 60s.
Wow, I never thought about that. It's not just a monster origin story. It's like a snapshot of a moment in history.
Exactly. And, the sources actually point out that that connection to real-world anxieties is part of what makes Gamera the Giant Monster different from other kaiju films. It's not just about spectacle, it's about something deeper. Those anxieties about what technology could do.
Okay, so we've got this giant fire-breathing turtle awakened by a nuke. Sounds kind of familiar. I mean, Godzilla had already been around for like a decade, and he was also an atomic age creation. Was Gamera just trying to ride that same wave?
It's a good question, and it's something that comes up in the sources.
Hmm.
While there are definitely parallels between Godzilla and Gamera, they do evolve in very different directions. Godzilla, at least in those early films, is often portrayed as this force of nature, a symbol of what happens when humans mess with things they shouldn't.
Right, like a punishment for our arrogance or
Yeah.
something. But Gamera, he kind of takes a different turn even in this first film. He goes on a rampage, of course, smashing
Yeah.
stuff up. But then there's that scene where he rescues the boy Toshio from the collapsing lighthouse. It's like this unexpected moment of heroism in the middle of all the chaos.
That lighthouse scene is so important. It really sets the stage for Gamera becoming a protector later, especially of children. It's fascinating to see that heroic element emerge so early on, even before the whole franchise fully embraces it.
So was that always the plan? Or was it something that just kind of happened while they were filming?
Well, that's where things get interesting, because the sources suggest it might have been a little bit of both. On the one hand, there's this Eskimo legend in the film that calls Gamera the Devil's Envoy. It's almost like they're hinting at his destructive potential right from the start.
But then he saves that kid. It seems like a total contradiction.
It does, and some critics think that it was actually this unexpected compassion that resonated with audiences, especially in Japan. It was like they saw something more in Gamera than just a monster, something that could be both powerful and protective.
It's like the audience was putting their own hopes onto this giant monster.
Yeah, especially the kids, and the filmmakers really seem to have picked up on that. You have to remember, this was 1965. Japan was still dealing with the trauma of World War II, and the fear of another war was very real.
So a giant monster who could protect people, especially children. That must have been a really powerful image.
It was, and it's so interesting to contrast that with Godzilla, who in those early films was a much more destructive and ambiguous force.
It's funny, we keep coming back to Godzilla, but it just shows how different those two franchises really are, even though they're both about giant monsters.
It's a classic comparison. They both tap into those Cold War anxieties, but they come at it from such different angles. Godzilla is like a symbol of our past mistakes, of the destructive power of technology, but Gamera becomes something else entirely as his character develops. He's more like a guardian, a symbol of hope and resilience.
Okay, but let's not forget that Gamera the Giant Monster is also a movie about, well, a giant monster. We've been talking about themes,
Yeah.
but what about the monster action? You mentioned the production side of things.
Oh, the production is a whole story in itself. It was a low-budget film, so they had to be really creative.
I think I read that they actually ran out of money during filming.
Yeah, they did. And it led to some really interesting choices. Like the Gamera suit itself. It was heavy and cumbersome and apparently really hot inside.
Oh, man, I can only imagine. Trying to stomp around and breathe fire in that thing must have been a workout.
Actually, get this. The original stuntmen quit because the suit was so difficult to wear.
They quit. Wow. So did they just give up on the movie?
Uh-huh. No, they didn't. The special effects crew had to scramble to find a replacement. They ended up drawing lots to see who would wear the suit.
That's dedication. It makes those scenes even more impressive knowing what they went through to bring Gamera to life.
Absolutely. And they used all sorts of tricks to create those monster scenes on a tiny budget. Forced perspective camera angles, even stock footage. They were really resourceful.
It's amazing what they accomplished with what they had.
Yeah.
It proves you don't need a huge budget to make something visually striking. those scenes still hold up pretty well even today.
They do. And I think there's a certain charm to those old school special effects that you just don't get with CGI. You can really feel the effort and ingenuity.
So we've got this giant monster brought to life through some really creative filmmaking. But what about the human characters? Gemmer's not the only one dealing with this crazy situation.
That's right. We have this whole cast of characters who are trying to understand and deal with this Gamera crisis, and their reactions really highlight those anxieties we were talking about earlier, the power of nature and the consequences of technology.
You mentioned the American release of the film Gamera the Invincible. It seems like that version took a different approach to the story.
It did. It's a great example of how cultural context can change how a story is interpreted. They added new scenes with American actors and even changed the soundtrack.
I read that they tried to make it more action-packed, more appealing to a Western audience.
Yeah.
But it sounds like those changes also messed with the tone and pacing.
Yeah, they did. And it sparked a lot of debate among fans about which version is better. Some people prefer the original Japanese release, others like the American version.
It's like two different films almost, even though they're based on the same story.
Exactly. It reminds us that stories can be interpreted in different ways and that our cultural background influences how we understand them.
So we've got the Japanese film Gamera the Giant Monster, reflecting those post-war anxieties and exploring complex themes of nature versus technology. And then we have the American version, Gamera the Invincible, which focuses more on action and spectacle.
Two sides of the same coin. And both versions have something to offer, depending on what you're looking for.
So we've really dug deep into Gamera the Giant Monster. We talked about the Cold War and the production and even the American version. But before we wrap up, what do you think is the most significant thing about this movie?
That's a tough one. I think for me, it's how Gamera the Giant Monster is both a product of its time and something that goes beyond that. On one hand, it's definitely rooted in Cold War fears. All that anxiety about nuclear war and the world changing so fast.
Right, Gamera himself is like this symbol of unpredictable power, something humans can't control.
Exactly. But then there's this other side to it, too. This deeper human need for connection, for safety, even when everything is chaotic. And that's where the lighthouse rescue is so important.
Yeah, it's like Gamera stops being just a monster in that scene and becomes something more. And it ties in with Japan's recovery after the war, the rebuilding, and hope for the future.
It's like Gamera, this giant fire-breathing turtle, becomes a symbol of that resilience. Overcoming hardship and finding hope even in the darkest times. That's a message that still resonates, I think.
We've talked a lot about how Gamera is different from Godzilla, but they both kind of evolved over time to reflect how society was changing.
That's true, and that evolution shows how powerful these stories are, how they adapt and stay relevant for different generations. Gamera started as a rival to Godzilla, but he became something special, an icon especially for kids who see him as a symbol of strength and courage and protection.
And it's not just about the monster. The Gamera movies, even with all the battles and special effects, they also have these deeper themes about things like the environment and friendship and facing your fears.
You're right, and those themes woven into these fantastical stories, that's what makes Gamera more than just a monster movie. They offer something meaningful, something that speaks to our shared humanity, even in the middle of all the monster mayhem.
So for our listener who wanted to know more about Gamera the Giant Monster, I hope this deep dive has helped you appreciate it not just as a cool monster movie, but as a film that reflects its time and explores these big ideas and offers this surprisingly hopeful message.
And if this deep dive has made you curious about Gamera or even just other kaiju films, I hope you'll keep exploring. There's a whole world of giant monsters out there with amazing stories to tell.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.
Until then, keep learning and keep asking questions and keep an eye out for giant fire-breathing turtles.